And so we begin our discussion on the brain. The brain is divided into 4 basic parts, and so I'm just going to introduce them. This is probably the handiest way to see them in sort of a 3-dimensional way. The 4 main parts are the cerebral hemisphere. We're going to be coming back to the cerebrum, and we're going to be, the largest part is called the cerebrum. It is the outermost part of the brain. It takes up about 83% of the brain's mass, and we're going to be coming back to this. This is in charge of a lot of our higher order of thought. So what makes us human. Deep inside of the cerebrum, then we have 2 different sections, the diencephalon. The 2 very well-known areas of the diencephalon are called the thalamus and the hypothalamus. There are many automatic things that happen inside of the diencephalon. This is where a lot of your processing happens, where signals are being sent and kind of a decision as to where things should go. For example, visual information or information on smell, or a decision about what sorts of things should be, what muscles should be moved in the body and things like that. And then also there are some decisions made about some of the automatic things that happen inside of your body, such as heart rate or digestion or breathing rate. I should not say breathing rate. Breathing rate happens in the brainstem. Body temperature regulation would happen in the diencephalon. Your circadian rhythm or sleep-wake cycles are decided in the diencephalon. Then we have this part in here, which is the brainstem, midbrain pons, and the medulla oblongata. And as you can see, the medulla, which is interestingly oftentimes known outside of anatomy circles, the medulla, just because it has such an interesting name. The medulla is also sometimes just called the medulla. The medulla oblongata is its full name. So these 3 parts are part of the brainstem. They are in charge of some other automatic things that happen inside of the body. A lot of information about movement or sensation happens inside of the brainstem. The pons and the medulla have your breathing centers, your respiratory centers inside of there. So that is the brainstem. And so you notice the brainstem and the diencephalon are both located deep within the cerebrum. When you undergo brain damage from, say, a car accident or a sports injury, it is very unlikely that these 2 parts of the brain will be damaged. It's much more likely that the cerebrum will be damaged. So your body could easily stay alive, whereas you have no function left as far as voluntary function or thought processes or higher order cognition, and yet your body could still be alive. This is why we oftentimes call people brain dead, in that they no longer have functionality in their cerebrum, but their bodies are still alive because these more rudimentary parts or these more archaic parts of the brain are still alive. The last of the 4 parts of the brain is the cerebellum back here. The cerebellum, the way I'll describe it is to say cerebellum means tiny cerebrum, literally translated as tiny cerebrum. The cerebellum is in charge of a number of different functions, but I think it's best known for fine-tuning movement. I call this the involuntary control or voluntary movement, and we'll come back to this again. So the cerebellum is important in making certain that you move correctly. The decision to move any of your skeletal muscles will come from the cerebrum, but the fine-tuning of that movement will come from the cerebellum. Here's a nice lateral perspective. It's a mid-sagittal slice. This brain has been sliced through what we call the longitudinal fissure. It's not shown in this picture. It's shown in this picture here. This is called the longitudinal fissure. If you're looking at the brain from an anterior perspective, you'll see this fissure, very, very obvious fissure that divides the brain into left and right halves. And so what we've done here is we've sliced through the longitudinal fissure. We've sliced in a mid-sagittal way that allows us to see all these different structures. This is an actual brain, it looks like, but it has been painted or colorized somehow so that you can actually see the different parts. So we have this cerebrum, this massive cerebrum that is superficial to just about everything. The cerebellum back here, diencephalon, and brainstem. And so those are the 4 parts of the brain. Let's take a closer look at that cerebrum then. As I said, the cerebrum is in charge of higher level function. It takes up 83% of the brain's mass. The two halves, the left and right, are separated by that longitudinal fissure, shown kind of in this little sketch here. There are three basic parts to it. There is the cortex, the white matter, and then the basal nuclei. The cortex is this outer part here, and this is what we call the gray matter of the brain. And the white matter is deep to that. The white matter is all this stuff in here. You may remember that we talked about the white matter previously. The white matter are all of the myelinated axons, and so it indicates that axons are taking information to other places. If you look closely at a brain, you'll be able to see stripes in the white matter. And so you can see the tracks that those axons are taking from, say, one half of the brain to the other, going from the left to the right side and back, taking information back and forth into different parts of the cerebral cortex in order to allow for high-level thought processes to take place. So the cortex is this outer part. It is 1/2 centimeters thick. It runs the entire, it's a ribbon that runs the entire length of the most superficial part of the brain, including dipping into these little fissures here, tiny little fissures. In this case, these are called sulci, or sulcus for singular. And then these parts that bulge outwards are called gyri, or gyrus for short. So the brain has sort of especially the human brain, has lots of dips and bumps. Sulci dipping in, gyri bulging out. This is an actual brain slice here, so it shows how nicely that gray matter and white matter show up. So the gray matter, the cortex, is made primarily of somata, cell bodies, and also dendrites, and then those axons that are myelinated are deep inside of that, considered the white matter of the brain. The deep sulci will divide the brain into, divide the cerebral hemispheres into 5 lobes. The frontal lobe, shown here. The parietal lobe, shown here. The temporal lobe, here. The occipital lobe, here. And then the insula. And what you have to do for the insula is you have to actually separate out the frontal lobe here. You see, you can kind of pull them apart, and the temporal lobe. And deep inside of here, you'll have this structure that is called the insula. The insula is very important for lots of emotional processing and things like that. So from this point on, I'm not going to be discussing the lobes of the brain so much, but rather the functional areas of the brain. One of the structures you will have to get to know is that central sulcus. That will actually be very, very important. Here's the central sulcus. It is probably the most obvious sulcus that we have in our brain. You can see that it's actually difficult to parse out here. I believe this here is the central sulcus in an actual brain. It's much easier to see in models. They always make sure that the central sulcus is very obvious. The central sulcus will go all the way from the left to the right, just like a headband. It kind of just goes through the whole thing, even though we're only showing one side here. And to go along with that, we will have a precentral gyrus, a bump that is just anterior to the central sulcus, and a postcentral gyrus, which is just posterior to the central sulcus. So when we look at these brains, it's helpful to immediately be able to recognize that the anterior part of the brain is kind of this pointy part here, so this will be your frontal lobe. And then you'll have the cerebellum back here in sort of the posterior, what's the word for it? Posterior and inferior most part of the brain is going to be your cerebellum. And so if you can recognize those structures, I think that would be helpful in immediately being able to recognize some of the architecture of the brain that we're going to be discussing later.